All right, hello. So my name is Sarah Evans. I'm also a publishing manager with our editorial team. I joined the company over 9 years ago now, came in as an assistant editor with a background in Renaissance literature, but also with a background volunteering in archives, so the archive is kind of very close to my heart. Obviously joining as an assistant editor, I've worked on a huge amount of products, some really exciting areas from Victorian tourism through to migration and to sex and sexuality as well. And along the way, I've developed what I think is a healthy, what some of my colleagues might think is slightly unhealthy, familiarity with our systems, our software platforms, and our technical processes. So consequently, I spent a year away from the editorial team, working on the release of our new website platform. And I now work really closely with our technical teams to kind of really help articulate and drive our editorial strategy to make sure that all of the digital functionality that we produce for each unique collection is as intuitive as possible and meets the needs of all users at all levels. So, following on from Dan and Lindsay, what I'd like to do now is focus on how functionality available through the digital archive can be utilised to help bypass archival and particularly metadata biases and amplify that research experience, so breaking down the barriers in a traditional archive to discovering those hidden narratives. So as we've been hearing, archival practices, and particularly kind of the capture of metadata, has been heavily influenced over the years by external factors. So we've got political climates, social acceptance, legal debates, and these kind of have evolved very slowly. And I was talking to a couple of people earlier about Library of Congress subject headings and how slowly they move and how slowly kind of that metadata changes. And obviously those move with changing global attitudes. As Dan kind of explained earlier, the contextualisation, therefore, of some of that out-of-date terminology and the acknowledgement of those absences is therefore kind of really paramount to helping researchers navigate those silences and understand the context surrounding the available metadata. This is obviously ongoing and frankly quite a mammoth undertaking, so there's no real quick fix to providing a researcher with everything they need in the most accessible and contextually appropriate manner. In order to do this as a researcher in the physical archive, you need to read and study that material. It may not immediately be apparent where other relevant documents are available, and there are other barriers that we've already spoken about, such as handwriting, language, Latin being a really good one, which kind of really hinder the ability to find that relevant narrative thread. And this is kind of really where the digital archive comes to the fore, because what you are able to do is open up opportunities to overcome some of these barriers and biases. And one of kind of the first things that I want to speak about is the application of AI technologies, such as handwritten text recognition, or HTR, and the application of that across manuscript material and how that helps in the digital archive sphere. So back in 2017, HTR was first applied to colonial America, a resource dedicated to the renowned Colonial Office File held here at the National Archives, which document the history of the 13 colonies from their early interactions with Indigenous peoples through to the dawn of the American Revolutionary War. So HTR searching has the ability to sidestep metadata, which could include intentional and unintentional biases, and search the actual text of the primary source instead. So if a researcher discovers a named individual within a single source, for example, they can then perform that search and return all results across every document included in that resource, regardless of whether that figure is a colonial governor whose name would probably have been captured in that metadata right from that cataloguing inception, or a colonised, enslaved or otherwise marginalised person whose name may never have been recorded. So at sort of AM, what we are doing is applying that software to all manuscript sources, both on new and previously published resources as well. So really kind of helping researchers search those historic texts freely and opening doors to those previously opaque voices within the collections. So the AM platform on which we host all of our new and migrating resources is externally known as Cortex, which allows institutions around the world to benefit from obviously 30 years of our digital publishing experience to showcase, share and celebrate their archival material on an open access basis. So in recent conversations with staff at McGill University, they noted that a particularly exciting aspect to their application of HTR using Cortex was seen as they were enhancing their fur trade collections. Although primarily authorised or authored by the company's European management, the holdings in this collection reveal, although slightly indirectly, the presence of Indigenous voices and the extent to which their knowledge was critical to the success of the company and of the fur trade itself during the 18th and 19th centuries. And this conclusion is made all the more visible by the use of AI technologies such as HTR, which provide for the first time those searchable versions of handwritten documents. The addition of being able to download those transcripts alongside an HTR search is also therefore invaluable, particularly to students and early career researchers as they get to grips with historic handwriting and begin to employ paleography and those techniques for the first time, helping to overcome kind of these significant barriers often presented with a physical archive, which I touched on earlier and which Dan also mentioned. So both HTR and its corresponding optical character recognition, or OCR, for printed documents are really powerful search enhancements, but when they're applied alongside the use of other technologies such as filters, they become a really effective mechanism to both narrowing down results and discovering those new narrative threads. So Lindsay spoke about Dr. Warren's contextualizing feature within the colonial Caribbean, which explains how much more likely you are to find evidence of enslaved individuals when things had, quote unquote, gone wrong. In the digitised record, applying metadata filters such as the document type allows a user to focus their search results on the records directly relating, in this example, to what went wrong. In the case of resources such as colonial Caribbean, or if we're considering another resource, slavery, abolition and social justice, this could include court records, it might include petitions, newspaper reports, and other legal documents which can be utilised to help read between those lines and piece together those otherwise silent narratives and kind of the collected narrative of freedom. The presence of date filters as well and the ability to specify a range of dates, both from the broad to the narrow, also enhances that researcher's ability to further focus using multiple parameters in tandem to pinpoint that desired item and that desired location. It's worth saying here, of course, that the successful use of filters is only as good as the level of detail available within the accompanying metadata, which is a significant driver behind our editorial additions and our editorial strategy as we update some of the initial cataloguing data. In sources written through the lens of colonial oppression, it's vital to consider how people or events may be described in a historic document, even if those terms are unacceptable today. So a basic search for example, quote unquote, slave within the colonial Caribbean returns over 2,300 different documents. Now, 400 of those hits are within the archival metadata. However, each source contains hundreds of instances within the individual images itself. In comparison, an alternative search for enslaved returns 300 results, with half of these appearing in the metadata. So this highlights the significant value of HTR when used with language of the period, and also speaks to the need to utilise outdated terminology to counteract the absence of such narratives and cataloguing data, and of course then the challenges of working with that in the physical archive when you're not looking at a digital version. So within the digital version, that one-click control, which allows you to immediately narrow to a full text, so encompassing the HTR, the OCR, and excluding the metadata results from the search, helps to shift the attention from those secondary descriptions to the written source, directing users away from the archival interpretation and helping increase the likelihood of discovering more hidden experiences. Lindsay's also outlined some of the types of supporting secondary and commission pieces which sit alongside the documents, framing the discussion and contextualising the content. Academic pieces are commissioned to help speak to those gaps in the historic record or to bring to the fore otherwise marginalised and sometimes entirely forgotten groups and voices, while the internally written introductions, for example, are designed to provide those contextual overviews, highlighting the sources and aiding effective navigation. In both instances, these important additions serve as jumping off points designed to prompt debate and enhance further discoveries by physically interacting and linking with the source material. The presence of this content within the digital sphere allows for the simultaneous searching of documents and contextualisation together, So results in both the primary and the secondary sources in the digital database are deliberately presented side by side. So you can directly situate the historical narrative alongside the scholarly debate and allow users to take full advantage of online functionality to support their research questions. So following this concept of interacting and linking to the digitised documents, this is another area that the Digital Archive excels and opens up possibilities which are not immediately available in the physical archive. So Dan earlier discussed the need to interact with kind of those different forms of legal records to piece together a full picture and at times read between those lines to understand the narratives of those individuals. Within a digital corpus, this can be effectively achieved by artificially linking or reuniting those records, which might be traditionally held in a different record class, on a different shelf, or even in a different archive. So it makes the act of viewing those physical items a much more exciting prospect and much less challenging than trying to do that in the archive. In a digital database, for example, a letter which promotes the act of enslavement can be linked to another containing evidence for abolition. So you're providing that curatorial opportunity to balance those sources. In another example, we can use an affidavit, which could be linked to a transcript of court proceedings, which in turn can reference and link directly to an accompanying newspaper report, and so on. The act of artificially bringing these sources together vastly improves the chances of those underlying voices being heard. On a related note, negotiating large forms of correspondence, for example, with indexes or references held in separate bound books or volumes presents the same kind of discoverability challenge in the physical archive. And that can be a particularly perennial problem with government records where you have indexes and the physical letters. And here we can use those linking technologies to effectively mimic that act of calling up both items, sort of splitting that screen, so you can be looking at the indexing and looking at the physical letters together and accompanying alongside. Whilst additional metadata such as thematic or regional groupings can be added to documents to enhance their digital discoverability, this type of overarching information generally applies to the whole. So what we can do in a digital archive is further improve that linking to points within the document, providing an index map. So this might take the form of displaying hyperlinked chapters within a book, for example. So at a glance, you can see the context and the content of that volume. Recent work on interwar culture took that a little bit further, where we pulled the article level information, so getting a full index of what is in those periodicals. And that aids a user's ability to browse and to search within their desired field. So the possibilities of that digital archive opens up with the application of these types of layered metadata, vastly improves the browsing and searching functionality, which helps further draw out those narrative voices. So the last area that I want to touch on, which is of paramount importance to the discoverability of sources, is the accessibility of the user interface itself. So at AM, we are committed to meeting the International Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to AA standard. This is significant and has continuing investment to ensure that the platform not only complies with these standards, but is future-proofed to enable it to cope with emerging changes and to accommodate that as well. So these are documented through our voluntary product accessibility templates, or VPATs, and the guidance around Section 508 compliance. All of that can be accessed through our website. However, we appreciate that compliance is just one step in delivering an accessible user experience. So Lindsay has already touched on some of the areas that this affects across the platform, from ensuring the site colours and the contrasts comply with web accessibility during design, to the application of focus mechanisms, screen reader compatibility, and keyboard shortcuts for visually impaired users. All new features and functionality updates also have accessibility considerations at their core, and this extends to the use of our language and our accessible guidelines and editorial as well. Making sure that there is, for example, no directional language, making sure that there is no colour-specific language, for example. We're all aware, however, that this is a constantly evolving area and there is still a lot to be done, and a particular focus for us as we look ahead to the future is around the display of our video content Whilst traditional time-coded transcripts have been available for many years, descriptive transcripts have recently been created for Victorians on film, providing a clear summary of on-screen activity for otherwise silent recordings. We're aware, however, that there are more updates to this, and there is new guidance focusing on the display of audio descriptive transcriptions, for example, both for spoken word and on-screen actions, enabling visual sources to be interrogated to the depth of the written and printed items, which is incredibly important for us to keep looking at. So throughout this session, I hope that I've been able to convey with some practical examples how a user's interaction with historic documents can be significantly enhanced by the possibilities inherent in a digital database. Through digitalisation and intuitive display, we can address fundamental issues of accessibility, help users negotiate metadata silences through the application of AI technologies such as handwritten text recognition. We can enhance metadata to filter and narrow search results and aid individuals to understand context alongside the primary source, directly comparing and linking between items to provide that complete or completer narrative picture. Many of us at AM are here because we understand the importance of the physical archive. Obviously, from my background, I did a lot of volunteer working in the physical archive. So it's a privilege from a digital sphere to be able to widen access and positively contribute to the global conversation on diversity, equity and inclusion. Thank you very much.